Hello, world. My name is Iryna Lambrianides, and I'm an Associate Director of Partnership Programs at the New York City Media Lab. The Media Lab works with a remarkable range of media companies, partner universities, students, and startups to explore the fast-moving changes in media, technology, and how they shape the society. Among the issues on our mind, of course, misinformation and disinformation are near the top of our list. I have a PhD in curriculum and instruction with specialization in international and intercultural education. I am a person of Ukrainian origin and have been volunteering to provide humanitarian aid to the people of Ukraine as a member of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Viewers around the world have been following the developments of the outrageous, senseless, brutal war of Putin's Russia against the people of Ukraine. The scale of human suffering, death, and destruction keeps rising. The information war has preceded and now is...
Iryna, I don't think your mic is on. We're not hearing you.
I can hear her.
I can hear her.
Never mind.
Okay. Thank you for looking out for the sound quality. So as I was saying, the information war has proceeded and now is being conducted in tandem with the physical war. What information about the war is true and what is fake? Today, we will learn more about this information war conducted by means of misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda from two of the leading experts in this field. We have here Laura Edelson, the co-founder of the New York University's Observatory. She's a PhD candidate in computer science at NYU's Stanton School of Engineering. Laura studies online political communication and develops methods to identify inauthentic content and activity. Her research on social media and ad spending at Facebook and her removal from Facebook platform has gotten extensive coverage from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, just to name a few. And we have a Joshua Tucker. He's a co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics and the Social Media and Political Participation Laboratory. He's a professor of politics, an affiliated professor of Russian and Slavic studies, and an affiliated professor of data science at New York University. He's also the director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia. Welcome, panel. Let's delve in. In recent days, the images and stories coming out of Ukraine are heartbreaking. The reporting from Bucha is hard to ever forget. Laura, do you think Russia's attempt to call the events in Bucha as fake are having any impact?
Not yet. I think this is just too egregious and outrageous. But I think one of the things we always have to keep in mind when you try to look at how information about events like these spread, it's very easy to look at only one market, right? I think that what has been going on in Bucha was actually very well documented, right? Unfortunately, we've been hearing from survivors. International media was able to observe what happened very soon thereafter. And we are getting those images. And so I think in the United States, in Europe, and most of the world that has a free press, it's very clear what happened, and there isn't a lot of doubt about it. That said, there are multiple markets here, right? I think the other markets that we have to be thinking about are obviously the Russian internal media market, to the extent that that's something we can observe. There's sort of related media ecosystems of particularly Russian speakers outside of Russia. And then I think the other one that I think is something we are going to have to continually monitor is the Chinese language, the Chinese Mandarin language media market, because I think, for Russia, this is a massive problem in that there is very clear evidence of war crimes. And so, if you're Putin and you're thinking about how you are going to stay in power on an ongoing basis, you have to be strategic. I'm very curious what Josh thinks about this, actually.
Thanks, Iryna. Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having me here today. Yeah, I agree 100% with Laura. I think that, this is a very useful framework to think about this, the multiple markets framework. To take a step back, though, even though I know that the title of our panel here is the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and disinformation. But I think what we're talking about here, and even on this very first question, shows that one lesson we're learning from what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening around the world in response to what is happening in Ukraine, is that social media and the digital information era generally can also play a huge role in spreading actual information. And I think we've gotten very caught up in disinformation because foreign influence campaigns, disinformation during election campaigns, these were all things that were really new to us and we very much associated with digital information. But we're seeing here in Ukraine, I mean, exactly as Laura was saying, right? Like, yes, we go immediately to the lie. The lie is something that comes about from discussions we've been having for the last 6 years. Oh, this is fake news. Like now you can say anything you disagree with is fake news. You lose an election in the United States, you can say it's fake news made up by the media, right? You have a massacre on the ground, you can say it's all fake. But the counter to this, right, is that it's not the case right now that everyone is caught by surprise that this was the Russian response. And we're not all throwing our hands up in the air and saying, oh my God, they're claiming it's a false flag operation, right? We're so used to this at this point that that's lost a little bit of its newness. It's what we expected them to say when these images first started coming out. But that's also the point, right? These images started coming out. Like this all, these images started coming out within, I don't know if it was hours, but within days after the Russian troops pulled back.
It was hours.
It was hours. This is not something we found out about a year and a half later, or even something we found out 3 months about later. This is happening in real time. And this goes back to the early days when we first started talking about social media. And we talked about it in terms of social media because that was the shiny new thing, but this is really digital media, the digitization of images, the spread through horizontal networks, all of these social media platforms that exist. And it's become like, it was already the case that these images were out there before the Russians could even get to the false flag. So then it looks reactive. And then it looks like things. So, I mean, I think we really are witnessing this, this return of information. And in a way, and I don't know why it is the case that, and maybe this is just because I'm someone who pays more attention to this particular area of the world. And maybe if we had Middle Eastern scholars on here today, they would say this was also happening, in Syria or Afghanistan, if it was people who are studying Afghanistan. But there is something about, but within a theater of war and the speed at which images are coming out, it does change the overall context here of what's happening. But with a very important caveat, and we can talk more about this, about exactly what Laura said, we really do have to understand that there are different audiences in different places who are getting access to different types of information.
So do you think Russian citizens are accepting these false narratives? You think they are keep buying the story of Ukrainian so-called Nazis? Even all these images of the brutality are breaking through the social media and through all the news.
Yeah.
But to Josh, right, and of the importance of social media and larger information war, and what an important vector it is for information of all kinds. There is a reason that Facebook was banned in Russia, as are many other social media platforms. There is a reason that TikTok, while not banned, and Facebook is not currently allowing any in Russia, right? Because it is very difficult to stop spread of information. And we talk about that because it is also difficult to stop the spread of disinformation. But in Russia's case, right, Russia is working very, very hard to maintain an iron grip on their own information ecosystem. And how else are they going to maintain this line that all Ukrainians are Nazis? That's only possible if they can maintain this very, very tight lid on what normal Russians see and hear. And I think that is where we see the importance of social media more broadly, and it's just completely changing how information is spreading. And I will change mics since apparently mine is not working so well.
So how have we seen these disinformation efforts evolving?
Iryna, maybe can you repeat the question?
How are we seeing the disinformation efforts evolving?
So, I mean, I think in one sense, they're evolving in reaction to events on the ground, in the sense that we originally had, the original narrative was before the invasion took place, that it was a narrative about a genocide that was taking place in the eastern part of Ukraine. It was a narrative about Ukrainians being ruled by Nazis and that Ukrainians would welcome Russians to liberate them, especially Russian language speakers in Ukraine. For those in the audience, I mean, I think most people know this at this point, but Ukraine is a country that's made up of both primarily Russian language speakers and primarily Ukrainian language speakers. And in particular, the idea was that the Ukrainians would absolutely welcome the Russians, that they would throw down their arms and join the Russians as they came in, that essentially that this was a liberation, this special military operation, as it was called, not a war, but it was a liberation effort to free the Ukrainian people. That was the original first narrative. That blew up in smoke, again, because of the information that came out from what was happening on the ground in Ukraine, because it reached so many people so quickly. That I think energized and galvanized the sort of Western response to this, and the kind of incredibly unified and much tougher Western response. Whether it's tough enough is a whole other question, but much more than people were expecting originally. Then when that sort of fell apart, there was this pivot for a brief period of time to talking about bioweapons labs, right? Because that was sort of like flailing around and grasping for something. And now reacting to this on the ground, now it's more reactive, right? A maternity hospital gets bombed, right? Oh, false flags, that was done by the Ukrainians. And that was sort of like a warm up for what we see in Bucha, and which I think is I'm very scared it's going to be even worse when we start to see what's going on in places like Mariupol or other places in the southeastern part of the country. But I think, so in that sense, it doesn't seem like it's a grand strategy, which actually overlaps very, very much with the military, what's happened with the military, which was, it seems like what the military and what Putin expected would happen was there would be a march to Kiev, the government would be replaced. This would be a quick, fait accompli, and then it would be a question about holding power in Ukraine. And since then, it's been very adaptive. It doesn't seem like there was a conclusive disinformation effort, planned to go long term with this. With the, but the other piece of this is what Laura brought up before about what is happening inside of Russia. And there has been, again, ramping up of the clampdown on information. Originally, Instagram was not banned. Banning Instagram is actually a very kind of dangerous move for regimes because it annoys people who aren't necessarily interested in politics. And Instagram plays a kind of big cultural role in a way that Facebook may not in a place like Russia where there are other alternatives. But as you've seen the sort of, just the kind of wanton pressure on Russian independent media to shut down any sort of vestige within the country of Russian independent media with these, draconian prison terms of 15 years for spreading fake news, which now gets defined as anything the Russian government. So I think it was clear that that was going to get ratcheted up if necessary. But as we know from this excellent book, if I can plug, by Dan Treisman and Sergei Guriev that just came out called Spin Doctors, it's really costly for regimes to engage in repression, right? It's easier for regimes to engage in information manipulation and make themselves popular, right? Repression's harder. It causes other consequences. It's more difficult to do. It takes up more resources. And so I don't even know, this may have been reactive too. I mean, again, they may have thought that in this 2 to 3 day easy scenario, this wasn't going to be necessary. And again, so I think it seems like a lot of it's reactive. I don't know, Laura, what's your take on that?
honestly, the thing I cannot stop thinking about is the interplay of the information war and the ground war. Josh, I kind of have a question for you. I mean, how much of the initial miscalculation that Putin clearly made was just a case of him believing his own disinformation? I mean, I think that, if you are starting from the belief that the Russians will be greeted as liberators, a lot of what Putin does makes sense. But I mean, my God, a misread of the situation, very clearly.
Yeah. And actually, I think you could also ask the other question, right? Like, how much of this wasn't a disinformation campaign? It was an information campaign, but they just were living in a kind of alternative reality, and they were repeating the information that wasn't actually in accordance with what was on the ground. There's actually a lot of great work on this in political science, and a lot of really good commentary that's come out of political scientists. I'll give a shout out in particular to my colleague Arturas Rosanas at NYU as well. I mean, we know, there are reasons generally that it's hard, when you're a leader, it's hard to get good information. When you're a leader, normally, even in a
Well, this is the
democratic
autocracy
system,
trap, right?
exactly. And it's much worse in autocracies where the people who are around you are there because they deliver you good news, because they're there because they stay in your good graces. There's an added layer here, though, in the case of Russia, and that would fits in with this military understanding here, which is that, Russia has been called a kleptocracy. And what they mean by this is it's a political system that's built around rents, which is a fancy way of saying funds that's extracted from the state or extracted from private actors, being distributed to cronies of Putin, to the people around Putin who, he enriches them, they enrich him, they stay in power. Now, but the way this often happens in Russia is money is appropriated by the state to do X, and then X minus some amount is actually spent on the task that was supposed to be done. And that some amount is then pocketed by people. Now, if that's happening in terms of military spending, and there's good reason to think that a lot of people who are involved in the higher level of military procurement have gotten quite wealthy during the Putin time. If that's happening in military, it's hard to not buy a missile. You can say that you had a missile, it's either there or not. But it's really easy to not do the maintenance on tanks or not do the maintenance on trucks that are supposed to be done. And so one of the things that's been suggested here about this alternative reality is whether, all this money had been given to the military to build this modern professional force. And then when it came time to use it, do you want to be the person who tells Putin that, no, actually, it's not in as good a shape as you think it is? And yet it's compounded by the fact that we know during COVID, Putin has been incredibly isolated, right? The visuals, talk about images again, spreading all over the internet, the visuals on him meeting with his security leaders where he has them, like a football field away here. So I think it's absolutely, it's a crucial point. And in some ways, I think it, as I said, I think it could go both ways. There is a sense, right? You repeat propaganda over and over again. I mean, Laura, I'd ask right back at you. Do you think in the beginning Trump really believed that the election was fraudulent? And do you think he believes it now, right? Like, you repeat stuff enough times, you come to believe your own
There's an
narratives.
aspect of psychology here where there's only so many times you can repeat a lie before your brain starts. It's like the what is it called? The availability heuristic of I've just said this thing so many times it feels familiar and therefore it feels true. It's a common trap of human psychology. I mean, I think what is to me so fascinating is every time we get to talking about these weird things happening on the internet, um, we get pulled right back into these very real things happening on the ground, like everything we are witnessing that happened in Bucha and likely, unfortunately, other places like Mariupol. But the problem is that it is a cycle, right? Some of these things, right? If some of these atrocities, not if, right? These atrocities clearly happened, but if what we are hearing about the whys and the hows are true, the mechanics of it happened because Russian soldiers were convinced of these palaces of lies. That is how you convince people to commit atrocities like that. And then we come back to this sort of this propaganda machine. And Josh, as you talk about the repression in Russia that has allowed a lot of people to believe these kinds of things. So I just start thinking about this overall cycle where disinformation, the information war feeds the groundware, feeds the kinetic war, that again feeds the information war machine. And it feels so, the information war feels both so petty and meaningless compared to this very real horror on the ground. But also, I know that information war is propping up all of those atrocities.
So to the topic, Josh, you have previously spoken about there being at least three, if not more, distinct potential disinformation theaters in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Information in Ukraine, information in Russia, and information in the rest of the world. Can you talk about how these are different from each other?
Sure, and this builds very much on what Laura said in her opening remarks here. I think the key thing about the key distinctions here. Well, first of all, there's going to be different goals, right? So if you think about this from the point of view of the Russian government, right, the goal within Russia is to manage the information to which people have access, and it's going to be, you know, spinning the story of how the war is going from the sort of Russian perspective. The goal in Ukraine, I think we talk about like different types of disinformation, but in the field of war, there has always been, information ops is as old as warfare is itself. And so when I was talking about that early on, I one of the things I was talking about is disinformation about, like, we saw, for example, there was like a deep fake of Zelensky saying that troops had surrendered and to lay down their arms. And that's the kind of stuff I was looking for a lot in the beginning. I was sure there was going to be a period of time, that as soon as Zelensky was out of the public view from 24 hours, you would see a whole run of things of what had happened to him. And I think in the very beginning, when there was this narrative that, Ukrainian soldiers were going to lay down their arms and join the Russian army, I thought for sure we'd see lots of disinformation around that. So that's a whole set of kind of battlefield disinformation. Although, as Laura said, right, like it's just another good reminder about how much this is dependent on what's actually happening in the real world. Zelensky hasn't disappeared. Zelensky has done the opposite of disappearing. It's hard to turn on the TV without seeing him these days.
I think we would be having a very different conversation if that were not the case.
Yeah. And then the rest of the world, I think what was really important here was what kind of a response you were going to get. We're 6 weeks in, right? And so it's hard to remember that in the beginning, people were shocked by sort of how much out of the gate NATO, EU, the West generally had been able to hang together, and how, and the series of, no one was talking about central bank reserves, for example, being frozen. So the extent of these sanctions and the fact that they keep getting ramped up. And so I think that external situation was crucially important in the beginning to show that this was not a fait accompli, that it was not over from the get-go, that the Russians hadn't just marched in and this was going to be something that the West could ignore because this fighting was going to be done in 5 days and they were going to be presented with a kind of settled situation on the ground here. And so I think that was incredibly important. And then I think, these other sorts of things that you see, mentioned, you can see them through these prisms. So and just to say, there's the West and then there's the rest of the world. So there's other things going on, and Laura brought up China and the global South and things like that. So I think every time you see some of these things go out there, like the bioweapons thing, which kind of came and went kind of quickly, that has implications for within Russia, to explain to Russians what the regime is doing is a good thing. But it also is yet another attempt to try to, maybe it's not going to peel away the West, but it's going to give people in the global South who maybe aren't inclined to be opposed to Russia another reason to sort of stick to their, tenuous position of supporting Russia at the United Nations or something like that.
Can we talk about what I see as huge pieces of good news in the information war landscape that Josh brought up? One of the things that I have found so fascinating about that early period of the war is, like Josh, like you, I was looking for those sort of first, I was waiting for like a really high quality Zelensky deepfake, because let's think about it. Let's drill in on that for a second. if you wanted to create optimal circumstances for how you would get a great deep fake, an actor that you have a lot of footage of, so just like the raw material that you need to make a good deep fake, you've got that for Zelensky because he was an actor, right? We have a lot of footage of this man. And then you have a really strongly motivated opponent who is willing to spend the money to make the best deep fake they can. You have a somewhat limited time horizon, but otherwise, this is when, if we were going to get a really great deep fake, we would have. And come on, it was not good. It was, I don't want to quite say laughable, but it was not convincing. It was not up to par. So I think that was really interesting. And then some of the other, kind of false flag videos or other things like that, the general quality of battlefield fake videos and disinformation content was just not great. It was just not like up to a level that I think most people would find convincing. And I think, to me, I was really I was heartened that the technology of producing fake content is not quite where it needs to be in order to really perpetrate these kinds of frauds right now, I think. And then the other thing that has made me feel really, really optimistic is the other thing. And I hope we can pause, Josh, for a second and talk about this biolabs conspiracy, because my God, until the start of this horrible war, whenever people would ask me, well, what can we do about disinformation? What can we do to fight misinformation? My answer was usually, we need to do more research because I don't have an answer for you. But now we are starting to have examples that I can point to say that worked. I mean, I think in general, what particularly the U.S. government and the White House deserve credit for is the amount of information that they proactively got out to the public about what was happening in, just on, in Russia and on the front. I think that was tremendously effective. And I think when we look at what happened with the biolabs conspiracy specifically, the life cycle of that piece of disinformation of like coming of when you saw Russian state actors really trying to push on this line that I know they'd been dabbling in for years, but you saw a concerted push. You saw it launder through Chinese state media onto the far right media and then back into the Russian domestic ecosystem. And most of the Western media ecosystem just did not pick it up, other than the far fringes. And I think I was really heartened by that. This is, I think, was a very specific example of pre-buttal working, and also our media being a little bit more resilient to this stuff. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's funny that you went to the bioweapons as the great success of it. I think it was, because I think that was immediately upon the lead up to the war. That was evident. Like the U.S. government intelligence, telegraphed exactly what was going to happen. And I think this idea of pre-bunking, is now the bio thing is a false thing. The lead up to the war, it obviously could have gone differently. But given that the Russians, in retrospect, were likely planning on doing this all along, or that Putin was planning on doing this all along, the fact that they spent the week and 2 weeks before the invasion saying, oh, here goes the West again, here goes NATO again, we try to talk about legitimate security, and all they say is we're going to go to war and we're going to do these horrible things. And then they go ahead and do those exact horrible things. And then there were some very specific things that exactly how they were going to do it, what they were going to claim, what they were going to say. It was, in a sense, it was kind of like a masterclass. And it's interesting because it was obviously clearly was dependent on a couple of factors. One was high level intelligence, which, as an aside, as a political scientist, if I'm Putin and I'm watching all of this stuff get broadcast by the US government ahead of when you do it, I'm really worried. Like, this is going to be a big discussion, I think, after this is all over, is how did the United States know everything that it knew ahead of time? Was it signals intelligence? Was it human intelligence? If I'm Putin, I mean, I'm worried that it's human intelligence and who is, and who's leaking from, again, he's not talking to that many people. But so I think that this was, so A, there was a very, very, good intelligence effort. B, there was this strategy taken to try to do this pre-bunking of sharing intelligence widely, which I think bought the US a lot of credibility in this regard going into this. And then 3, there was a lot of attention paid to it. And I think one thing, Laura, I'm curious about your take on this, is that I think, yes, we want to be positive, and it is good to be positive when we can be positive about these things. I wonder how much this is a unique set of circumstances. I mean, our sense is, from a lot of the stuff that we look at, these things kind of thrive in the shadows. A lot of disinformation thrives in the shadows and takes a lot of time running around and spreading before it makes it mainstream, before it gets big, and before people are talking about it a lot. And there is just, in our research that we've been working on in our lab, one of the things we find out is that when people search for information online, often they encounter information that makes them more likely to believe misinformation. And that seems to be the case when it's the kind of stories that when you search for information about them, you primarily get back other low quality news sources because they are not really being covered by the mainstream media. And in this particular case, obviously there's tremendous attention from the whole world on what's going on in Ukraine. So those sort of corners that sort of grow, what Dana Boyd has called these data voids, areas where that's information ecosystems that are only being filled by bad actors. We're not in that kind of a case right now. And I do also, by the way, another thing I'm kind of curious about, Laura, but I also think some of these things now that we're dismissing, like the false flags, and like the bioweapons, they are, we're dismissing them for not having hijacked the conversation, not having changed the discussion that everyone's having, not having been adopted whole scale, not becoming a partisan event, right? You don't actually see Republicans in the United States lining up and saying, oh, these are all false flags. Everyone's on the same side of this one. And I haven't checked in with everybody. It's possible a couple of them, we all have to watch what Marjorie Taylor Greene says or Gossamer. But for the most part, these have not become partisan issues. But on the other hand, I wonder if they're also going to be things that are going to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4, festering things that are in these kind of corners of the Gabs and the Getters of the world. Are we going to see these things brought up again, or have they really been dismissed? And I don't know the answer to it, but I think it has been an unequivocal success that they haven't, surfaced, derailed the conversation, polarized politics around it.
Josh, I think you are so right on a couple of fronts. I mean, I think the thing that you brought up around what it took to do both those very specific pre-bunk efforts and then the more general informing the public about what was going on, that is not cost-free. There is a reason that the US government has not taken this approach in the past, and it's because they've quite fairly prioritized protecting their intelligence sources. And the choice to do this, it was a gamble. And at least right now, we can say that it's paying very, very clear dividends, that there are really huge gains to this approach. But we don't fully understand the costs. And the costs of making this amount of intelligence available to the public, we won't really understand that for maybe even years, right? Because we have to understand how this affects our ability to gather intelligence, again, not just in 6 months, but in 2 years. And so I think we just don't fully understand what this strategy really takes. We can see that this is working out. And there's something else that you brought up around how this might not be generalizable because, one, I think you are completely right that we just had the intelligence. We even could make that choice to do this. But in addition, I think that this is a circumstance, this is an environment that our mainstream media ecosystem was made for. There is a loud, specific event. They can go there, they can cover it, they can create compelling visuals, and they can source information, and this is what our media is really good at. Reporting on a slow-moving global pandemic where the facts are uncertain and frankly unknown, they're much worse at that because it's a nuanced, more iffy situation where there are literal unknowns. There are things that we won't know for years, and I think that is something that the media struggles more with. And I'm thinking about so the other, huge piece of misinformation that is continuing to swirl is about the pandemic. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because um, I know that as a parent, something that I struggled with through this entire period and that I still struggle with is just trying to understand how to make decisions about my son's health. So I have a 4-year-old who is not yet eligible for a vaccine, and I have struggled this entire 2 years trying to understand, right? Should my son be wearing a mask? The CDC and the FDA have differed on this. Um, there are so many things about, when is it safe for him to go back to his classroom? What kind of activities can he do with other kids? All of these things. There has been such terrible communication from these bodies. And in addition, right, there's just been unknowns. At least part of what has been difficult is I have gone to look for answers, and there just haven't been answers to give me. And so I think, what you're talking about is something that I can definitely sympathize about, how like you just want an answer. You go searching for an answer, and what you are looking for is any answer, anything that is certain. And I think that environment is one in which people are probably more likely to accept information that is less accurate because it's more certain, and that can feel like the same thing. And I do think it is a fair point that this just might not be something that is going to apply to other circumstances. But man, I'm an optimist. I'm just like so glad we can start to have literally I can just like start to look at examples that can work, because I think even just taking this lesson that um consistent information is helpful, taking this information that those information voids are really, really dangerous. Obviously, we have so much more research to do, and I cannot wait to see that study from you, Josh. I'm really sitting on pins and needles for it, but I'm I also think we are just so much that we are going to learn from this war.
Well, speaking about the information voids, most people in Russia do not know how to get around government-imposed access restrictions to obtain information from non-Russian news sources. So how can an average Russian citizen obtain truthful information about what is going on in Ukraine? And if receiving the truthful information, how can they determine if it's indeed the truthful information?
Yeah, and I think it's an important question to ask, even, who, if the average Russian citizen wants to get information from other sources here, as opposed to, it's hard to oppose your government. It's hard to think that what your government is doing is wrong, especially when the government claims to be doing it in the interest of the people. But to answer that in two parts, one is, it is the internet age. Like, there are ways to get around internet censorship, which involves VPNs, and we've seen skyrocketing downloads of VPNs in Russia since the cracking down on independent media sources has begun there. So that's one thing. The thing that I think is potentially more interesting, and Iryna, I'd love to hear from you on this. This was a point you raised earlier, right? Like, which is, how when people just don't seem like they want to believe things, how are you able to get through? And I think what's interesting here is that despite the lies Putin said before the election about, Ukraine not being a real country and not being separate people, obviously Russian and Ukrainian societies are very intertwined, and there are lots of people in Russia who have friends, who have family who are in Ukraine. And so one of the things that I think is interesting here is focusing on the role of kind of messaging apps. Like, we always think of like the way that you suppress information is to suppress media, right? If you don't have it on the TV or you don't have it on social media, people aren't going to know what's happening. But in the case of Russia and Ukraine, there is a lot of what we would call horizontal linkages here that aren't simply by social media, but are also just by people, other ways that people communicate, in particular messaging apps, such as WhatsApp, or thinking about things, other forms of messaging apps. And that makes me kind of wonder what's happening here, because we've all heard these like horrible anecdotes about people in Ukraine calling family members or friends back in Russia and saying, this is what's just happened, and then being told by their family members or friends, oh, no, you don't understand. That's actually being done by the Ukrainian army. You're getting fake news and fake stories about this. But, I recently saw, for example, for the first time, I saw the first what is known as a list experiment, asking people about their support for the war. And these list experiments, what they do is they take sensitive questions, and it's a way to elicit people's true preferences, but you don't ask them the specific question. You give them a list of statements and you ask them how many of those that you agree with. And half of the people get one fewer choice, and that one fewer choice is the thing you're really sensitive about, like what do you think about the war? And then you could take the average across the two of them and figure out how much support there is. And this suggested that when you used a list experiment, support for the war dropped from what looked like 75% when you were asking people straight up to about 50%. Now, that's still a large number of people supporting the war, but on the other hand, it's suggesting that, there may be in Russia. Yeah, these were Russian. This was a survey done in Russia. And by the London people, there's an article on it on the LSE blog. I'll put it in the comments. And it suggests that, one of the consequences of when I said before that it's costly for autocrats to engage in repression is that when you repress people, it becomes harder to know what they're thinking. So the irony here is that like Putin can try to control other people's access to information, but by being repressive, it also simultaneously makes it harder for Putin to understand where his support is among the population. And I wonder with these, you can close down the news, you can control the TV, but I wonder with these one-to-one kind of linkages, are we going to know when those actually start to make a difference? And and the other thing that is, that we need to talk about here is also body bags. And when people come home, and the more dead Russian soldiers there are, the harder it is, to just say everything is going fine. Now, there's a lot of people in Russia, and not everybody knows soldiers, and the upper and middle class elites know fewer soldiers than people from ethnic minorities and people who are from more rural, poorer areas do. But that's another piece. When your kid doesn't come home, and there's a history of mothers of soldiers activism in Russia, going back to the days of the USSR. And so I think all these things kind of combine to, yes, there's a simple answer. Get a VPN, you can download, you can read the New York Times. There's a longer answer here, though, which is about these kind of horizontal linkages and the extent to which, will we know when they matter? Is it the kind of thing, if you look back on Timur Karan's, fabulous work called This Now Out of Never, about how it's hard to see dissatisfaction with autocrats coming because there are all these incentives essentially. Well, it's a long story, but anyway, it's, I think I wonder about this. Is this happening already? And that list experiment was the first thing that that made me think, well, maybe it is beginning to happen already. Maybe people are not swallowing, the changes and the narratives that are coming out all of the time. I don't know, Iryna, I know we were talking before about like, if you have, I'd be curious if you have thoughts in this regard as well, as someone with more closer ties personally here.
It's hard for me to say about what people in Russia think, because I know what people in Ukraine think. All my family is there, but I know what my friends think. For example, I have a friend who's living in the United States, and her mother, they're Ukrainians, so they were sharing the information, the photos, what is going on in their city of Nikolaev with the sister who lives in Moscow. And the sister was actually saying it's not true. And she was trying to calm her mother down. Everything is well. Don't worry about it. So what I'm seeing here is a problem of how to communicate on the family level, how to communicate with people who are not using the technology, who do not know what VPN is, or are not willing to use the VPN. And another question is here is, it's easier to accept the narrative that is less painful. Maybe that's what I would imagine some people are looking to find, the reality that is less painful. and also how it is to determine what is true. I know Laura touched a little bit on deep fakes and seeing the low quality of the deep fakes, but how can an average person figure out that it's a low deep fake quality, and what is the truthful information indeed? Like, I sometimes have a difficulty believing certain things that I see online because they are so horrible that I just like pictures of a little girl being raped. It's so bad that one part of me is saying, oh my goodness, it's so bad, it's probably not happening. But if it probably is happening, but how can we navigate in this world of images and deepfakes and misinformation?
I would actually say it's worse than that. For people in Russia, this isn't just a matter of, oh, install a VPN and, get your factual news some other way. Russia's engaging in mass arrests. They have arrested, the last number I read was 15,000 people for engaging in anti-war protests. I have heard reports in media, I don't know how widespread this is, that people are being stopped and having their phones searched for evidence that they might be anti-war. That's some very real consequences for people. This isn't just a matter of finding out the truth. There are very, very real consequences for even seeking to find out the truth. So I think it is really tough. As Josh said, it's a very simplistic answer to say, well, get people to install a VPN and read the New York Times, because there are very, very real consequences for Russians. Obviously, nothing compared to the very real consequences for Ukrainians, but this is not cost free for just average Russians. In a very real sense, standing up to your government is a difficult thing. I mean, I do think we get back to the information war only takes you so far. And I mean, this is one of the things that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that the government's propaganda could no longer keep up with the reality on the ground. And, I think that is very, very clear to us in the West, that Russia's propaganda is kind of laughable against the reality that we do have very clear evidence of in the ground. And when we were talking about what's going on in Bucha, or what happened in Bucha, the thing I've been thinking about is how much social media has changed events like these. Because if you think back to the Balkans, the Balkan War, there were terrible atrocities, terrible war crimes that people had some sense that they should try to cover up, and that really made it much harder after the fact to try to prosecute people responsible. When we have immediate interviews with witnesses, when we have evidence being captured so soon after these events, I do think that at least someday we will have a much better chance of holding people accountable for those kinds of horrible events. And I do think that Josh keeps bringing this point that is so important about the costs of repression, and the costs both to any government who really tries to perpetrate this seriously, and the costs to a population. I do think we may just be in an environment where it is just very, very difficult to repress information for any real length of time. I think we are already starting to see cracks in this information dome that Russia is trying to to use to keep out the rest of the world. But as both of you have pointed out, Russia is so deeply connected to Ukraine and to other parts of the world that it's impossible. You can't. Russia is not and never will be the hermit kingdom. You cannot seal it off from the outside world. And I think that means that this kind of repression just can't really last. I don't know. Maybe I'm too optimistic.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit here. Let's speak about the open source intelligence. So social media documentation of the war have fueled the rise of open source intelligence. So how do you think How does this impact the stakes of the information war?
Laura, you want to? Are you? I mean,
yeah, I can. I mean, I think it is. You know, we've been talking a lot about this sort of documentation of war crimes that's been coming out. You know, but I do think one of the things that we have seen continually is that this. I would add this to the costs of trying to execute war in an urban environment. You know, if you're in an environment where there are a lot of civilians, at this point, what that means is that you're in an environment with a lot of people who are recording you everywhere you go and everything you do. And I think, you know, the rise of open source intelligence as something that is meaningfully shifting what is known about a theater of war is super interesting. But one of the aspects of it is that it is also a real flattening of intelligence, right? In the sense that that open source intelligence has been a really important source for governments, but it is open source. It is out in the public, and it means it is inherently not secret. And I think that change in who knows what and how it is known, that is like the very classic flattening effect of the internet. Josh, what do you think?
yeah, I think this plays into a larger issue here, which is that, you know, we're now, which actually, interestingly enough, you know, comes back to the sanctions here, and what we've been talking about as sort of the resolve of the West, is that it's just become a lot more apparent for companies, for governments, how easy it is for public pressure to build up very, very quickly. And then one of the things that I was struck by, and having been on many panels like this, but with people who are experts on sanctions, or people who, we had a great session on that at the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU. We had a whole sanctions panel, and also talking about people who are economic experts, right? Like, the way people used to think about sanctions was that sanctions would go in place and then companies would find ways to get around them. And there's still some of that going on here. But one of the things that we saw that was so interesting here was that so many companies were, in a sense, self-sanctioning themselves. Like, companies that didn't have to follow sanctions just wanted to get out of the way because they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the public attention on this. A stance, may I add, which has been vindicated as we've seen these horrendous atrocities coming out of the battlefield as well, right? Like, and so I do think that, you know, in the sanction, what's so I think we're kind of at a watershed moment for sanctions, whereas it used to be the idea you would implement sanctions and they would be weaker than you wanted them to be. We're now in this real world where it's possible. We're in a world now where you implement sanctions and they're stronger than you want them to be. And that really is, I think, fueled by this new world we live in. And it's a function, I think, for American companies of living in a world that's like post summer of 2020 with the social justice movements in the US, and how companies were suddenly realized that on a very quick moment, they could have to deal with these kind of big societal issues, even post Me Too, in, you know, the rise of Me Too in the United States. And so the reason I'm bringing all this up now in the context of open source is that if we think about things that can fuel public opinion in countries that then have to make decisions, or around corporations that have to make decisions here, the more information that's out there, it's one thing to rely on, you know, it's one thing to rely on the information that the news media transmits. And again, social media makes this all accessible much quicker. But the open source means that you're not even as dependent. It can even come even if the news media is not covering that. And so the idea, you know, I followed the open source stuff that I thought was so interesting was after 1/6 in the United States, you know, this incredible open source movement to identify people who had breached the Capitol. And I think that, you know, that when people look back on that is going to be been seen as sort of pushing law enforcement, because there was this information in the public and the public could say, you know, what's out there. And I think this can be a similar sort of thing. I mean, I've seen, you know, even now there is so much discussion going on, and it's incredible. Like, I mean, you know, we're talking about all events that have happened in the last, that have been brought, you know, the Russians having left within the last week or so when this starts to come out. And all of a sudden you have people who are doing all sorts of, you know, open source photography that's showing up about, you know, and video clips of things that were taken and all this sorts of stuff out there. So I do think it feeds into this information ecosystem. I mean, it's important in its own right. And if we had legal scholars here who were talking about war crimes trials and stuff like that, you know, the fact that you have your one sense of open source intelligence is there's just much more evidence of everything, right? But I think given what I study and the way we think about how this reverberates through public opinion, is I do think it opens up yet another avenue, right, for the mass public to become informed in a way that policy leaders in countries will feel pressure to respond to. And it's 6 weeks in, and we keep seeing there's got to be a new sanction. There's got to be something new that's announced after everything that happens. And I think it's a small part of that cycle, but it's a piece of it, and it's probably, you know, and it may turn out to be an important piece, especially as this drags on longer. I think if you saw a situation where this goes on for longer periods of time, it falls off the, you know, the top of everyone's agenda for a little while, and then open source intelligence contributes to discovering something that brings it back on, you know, that will be an even larger role for it. But I think it's already part of that system.
So speaking about the responsibility, what responsibility then should the news organizations or media companies carry if they promote or they host fake news?
I mean, I think this is something that, one, is perpetually a problem in a war zone, right? I can't believe we've gotten to nearly the end of this webinar, and this is the moment I get to say, truth is the first casualty in war. But you know, I do think that we've already seen multiple occurrences of the news media having to report on something, and then it turns out the truth is something slightly different. But I do think for the most part, the media has been doing a relatively good job about reporting this is what we know right now. I think that, you know, this is a classic circumstance where the media has really strong incentives to report things quickly, and we are just in an ongoing, we are perpetually in a developing circumstance. Getting back to something that Josh said a little while ago about the interplay of sort of open source intelligence and news media and public opinion, I think one of the things that is so interesting is, like, I don't know about you, but I definitely had the sense that Ukraine war coverage was dying down, and then some of the images of what happened in Bucha started to come out, and that is because of that is effectively open source intelligence, and that is when, you know, everything is popping back up to the surface again. And you know, I do think that open source intelligence has shown the ability to drive the news cycle, yes, but also really to drive public opinion. And tying back to Josh, what you were saying about sanctions before as well, like, I think governments are perpetually in this cycle where they can never have sanctions go too far in advance of public opinion, because people feel sanctions. And you know, if they're strong sanctions, like, we're all feeling the effect of you know, of higher energy prices, right? This is at least partially related to sanctions. You know, but I do think that the speed at which we are getting information because of open source intelligence is allowing for political political public opinion to not have doubts, because like, how can you have doubts when there's such strong evidence about what is going on?
Thank you, Laura. I have one quick question. We have 2 minutes left for each of you. So very briefly, in 1 minute, how do you win the information warfare?
I mean, I think we've seen a sort of moment for this approach to pre-bunking, right? Like, you know, I'm with Laura. I mainly say my answer to this is we need much more research, and I'll still stick with that, because I think a lot of things that people think helps with at the micro level, people's ability to understand the veracity of news doesn't actually help. And we could have a whole other much longer seminar on that point alone. But I do think, you know, at the macro level, this idea of pre-bunking, of preparing people ahead of time for potential disinformation campaigns they're going to hear, but also seeding with them ideas of, of truthful ideas of what's happening. It is it's been an interesting moment in that regard. And I think that, so I think that is encouraging. We talked a lot about during the session about why it might be a particularly set of unique circumstances, but I think governments being proactive in this regard. You talk about open source. What happened here was the U.S. government shared more of the intelligence it's known. And, we know that U.S. in the past has shared intelligence that's turned out to be wrong, right? But in this particular case, it shared intelligence that turned out to be correct. And I think that was valuable in this regard. And they deserve credit for that. And, and it wasn't a foregone conclusion that it was something they were going to do.
And Laura, thank you.
I was just going to say everything that Josh said. Thank you.
And I would like to thank our panel of experts, Laura Edelson and Joshua Tucker, for this enlightening conversation on shedding some light on the war in Ukraine and how to make sense out of information, misinformation. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Iryna. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for doing this. Bye.
Great to talk with you.